We have two very eminent writers here with whom I'll be in conversation for a while. In fact, I've been asked to play a kind of double role. I'm supposed to be a writer here and also the moderator. I was really wondering how to go about it. So maybe I thought I'll use up a few minutes to read a few poems. I will not be part of the conversation, except that I'll be asking a few questions to Sethu. And Mr. Kambar has said he will be making a kind of statement about his writing. I hope you know them. I'm sure you know them, but still, maybe formally and very briefly, I will introduce them to you. Of course, their detailed bios are in the brochure, which all of you must have. Chandrasekhar Kambar here, to my left, was born in 1937. No problem revealing your age, you know. Yeah. He's a poet, a playwright, a fiction writer. He has directed quite a few films based on his novels, and he's one of the most outstanding folklorists of Karnataka. He's an educationist. He was the founder and vice chancellor of the University of Hampi, the Kannada University in Hampi in Karnataka. And he was also the chairman of the National School of Drama and of the Sangeet Natak Academy, and has had a long association with Sahitya Academy, the National Academy of Literature in India. And he has won, well, I don't know what the award he has not won really. You know, all the major awards in Karnataka, like the Kannada Sahitya Academy Award, the Pampa Prashasti, then the Sahitya Academy Award, Kabir Samman, and Jnanpith, which is supposed to be the biggest of the awards given to a writer in India. He is also a Padma Shri. Yeah, he has 25 plays, 11 collections of poetry, 5 novels, 16 works based on his research into folklore. And he has also been widely translated. Some of you must have seen his plays like Joko Maraswamy and Siri Sampige, which are available in translation published by Seagull, Kolkata. And to my right is Sethu Madhavan. He writes under the name Sethu, born in 1942. So I feel quite young with both of them to my side. He's a writer of short fiction and also of novel. Yeah, to speak about his career, he worked in a bank and retired as the chairman of a major bank in India. He's very widely traveled, and now he is the chairman of the National Book Trust India, which, as you know, is the major book publisher and promoter of books in the country. He has written 18 novels so far, 18 collections of short stories, and then quite a few anthologies and selections of his works. And there are also 2 collections of his essays on literature. He has also been translated widely into English, many of his stories, and two of his novels, Pandavapuram and Niyogam, are available in English, and also into quite a few Indian languages. He has won Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, I mean all the major awards in Kerala, besides of course the Sahitya Academy Award. So we have 2 very significant writers in the Indian languages near me. What I will do is, as I said, I'll take a few minutes to not to introduce myself. I'm in the sense of reading some of my poems. And after that, I'll put a few questions to Sethu. We will have a conversation, and I'll ask Kambar to make a statement on his writing. He said he would be more comfortable making a kind of statement. Yeah. I write, like Sethu, I write in Malayalam, but here I am reading some English translations, my own translations of my poetry. For the sound of my language, I think it's my duty to my language that I speak a few words in Malayalam. From one of my early poems, En Choreyilundoru Suryan, കുങ്കുമഗന്ധം വിതറി ചെങ്കനൽ ചുറ്റും ചിതറി കത്തും തരുണാരുണ ചഞ്ചല സൂര്യൻ. എൻ കൺകളിലുണ്ടൊരു സൂര്യൻ നീലിമയിമയിൽ നിവർത്തി നീലിപ്പീലി വിടുർത്തി നൃത്തം ചെയ്യും പേലവ നീല സൂര്യൻ. Well, this is how Malayalam sounds. Should read four or five very short poems to begin with. This is a poem that some of you must have listened to me because I have been here every year and I've been reading. Stammer. Stammer is no handicap. It is a mode of speech. Stammer is the silence that falls between the word and its meaning, just as lameness is the silence that falls between the word and the deed. Did stammer precede language or succeed it? Is it only a dialect or a language itself? These questions make the linguists stammer. Each time we stammer, we are offering a sacrifice to the God of meanings. When a whole people stammer, stammer becomes their mother tongue, as it is with us now. God too must have stammered when he created man. That's why every word of man carries different meanings. That's why everything he utters, from his prayers to his commands, stammers like poetry. The mad. In fact, I come from a family of mad people. Literally, I had a grandmother, I had one of my mother's sisters, I had an uncle, all of them considered mad by the common standards, even though I have very different standards of sanity. And I have always felt that maybe I understand these mad people much better than the so-called sane people, who loot and rape and murder. So this is a kind of celebration of madness. The mad. The mad have no caste nor religion. They transcend gender, live outside ideologies. We do not deserve their innocence. Their language is not of dreams, but of another reality. Their love is moonlight. It overflows on the full moon day. Looking up, they see gods we have never heard of. They are shaking their wings when we fancy they are shrugging their shoulders. They hold even flies have souls, and a green god of grasshoppers leaps up on thin legs. At times they see trees bleed, hear lions roar from the streets. At times they watch the heaven gleam in a kitten's eyes, just as we do. But they alone can hear ants sing in a chorus. While patting the air, they are taming a cyclone over the Mediterranean. With their heavy tread, they stop a volcano from erupting. They have another measure of time. Our century is their second. 20 seconds and they reach Christ. 6 more, 21 I should say now. 6 more, they are with the Buddha. In a single day, they reach the Big Bang at the beginning. They go on walking restless, for their earth is boiling still. The mad are not mad like us. This is a more recent poem, Burnt Poems. Because I'm making a few references to poets here. Of course, poets you know, Sylvia Plath, Anna Akhmatova, women poets, I mean, Kamala Das, and the major Bhakti poets of India like Meera, Andal, Mahadevi Akka, and to Szymborska, the great Polish poet whom I admire a lot, and also to Sappho, perhaps the first known lesbian poet. It's called Burnt Poems. I am a half-burnt poem. Yes, you guessed right, a girl's love poem. Girls' love poems have seldom escaped fire. Father's fire, brother's fire, even mother's, an heirloom. Only some girls half escape. Those half-charred ones we call Sylvia Plath, Anna Akhmatova, or Kamala Das. Some girls, to escape fire, hide their desire under the veil of devotion. Thus is born a Meera, an Andal, a Mahadevi Akka. Every nun is a burnt love poem addressed to the ever-young Jesus. Rarely, very rarely, one girl learns to laugh at the world with that tender affection only women are capable of. Then the world names her Wisława Szymborska. Of course, Sappho, she was saved only as her love poems were addressed to women. I'll end with just another poem. This is a poem dedicated to Irom Sharmila. I hope quite a few of you know that Irom Sharmila is a Manipuri poet, a woman who has been on a fast for the last 12 years against an atrocious act called the Armed Forces Special Power Act, which was misused widely in the Northeast. Women were raped, young men were killed using this rule, and even after 12 years, she's still continuing. She's being force-fed by the state to keep her alive, but she's still on a fast. So here is Irom Sharmila herself speak. Of course, this was also translated into Manipuri, and I read it to her when I went there. The poem is called Yes. She is the speaker. My body is my flag at half-mast. My water comes from tomorrow's river. My bread from the wind's kitchen. In my brain is a bullet, green like the clairvoyant's parrot. My name is the last letter of my ancient language, the final answer to every riddle, the moral of every proverb, the god of every magic chant, the ominous truth of every oracle. My life leaves me every day, and every day it comes back like the bird that survives the hunters to return to its nest with the odor of the forest rain. In the night, emptied of the morning's greetings and the evening's prayers, I lie alone under one desolate star, like the broken bench in an abandoned village tea shop, holding on still to the warmth and odor of yesterday's visitors. I have forgotten love, like the nameless flower once seen in a flash on a village hillock. My childhood lies sunk in the sand like the paper boat pulped by the heavy rain. My poems are the autumn's last yellow leaves. My kids turned into vapor by the echoes of rifles' reports will come down heavily as a rain of blood over those soldiers of hell. I won't be there, but my hope will be a word from the mountain that doesn't need to be tube-fed, a poem from the woods no boots can crush, an alphabet of steel no bayonet can pierce, a purple hibiscus, my Manipur heart ever in bloom. Thank you. Well, I really wanted to ask Sri Chandrasekhar Kamba something about his early life and his influences, especially because he's a folklorist, and folklore has had a deep impact on his creative writing too. And how did he happen to develop this interest in folklore? Was it his village life, or was it a deliberate kind of choice that he decided to study folklore? And he also handles many genres like drama, poetry, fiction, with equal felicity. And how does he choose one form or the other when he has some theme in his thoughts? And also, he is a great lover and a champion of the Kannada language, because he was himself an educationist, and he has championed the cause of the language to a very great extent. And he has written, as I said, 25 plays, including Jo Kumaraswamy and Siri Sampige, about which I wanted him to say something. And also something about the films he directed and what are the problems he has when he translates a work of fiction or a play into the language of the film, and what is the kind of relationship between tradition and modernity, which has been one of the major preoccupations in most of his writings, both in his discursive writings as well as his creative writings. And also there is a place that reappears in many of his works called Shivapura. So I just wanted to ask him, is it a real place? Is it an imaginary locale? Is it a metaphor, a character? What exactly Shivapura represents? And I would then also like him to ask a few poems. Well, I had sent these questions to Kamba, so he has tried to compress the responses to these questions in a short kind of paper, which I request Kamba to read out, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Sachin. Friends, I'm very happy to be in your midst today and addressing the huge gathering in one of the most prestigious literary festivals in the world today. Though for most writers, writing has become a lone odyssey, somebody like me who comes from a strong folk tradition chooses it differently. Not hailing from the family of the learned, I imbibed song, story, poetry, theater, and music in the collective atmosphere of occasions like festivals in which the whole community would gather and enjoy the expressions of the community's cumulative wisdom. The myth and narratives underlying such expressions, the metaphors, jokes, proverbs that laced them, constituted a kind of shared grammar, enabling everybody to partake of feast of words. Born into such a culture in a tiny village called Ghodgeri in Karnataka, I was forced by my school and college education later into starting writing in loneliness under the crushing impact of cities. At that time, our literature had entered the milieu of modernism, a culture of alienation from one's own word and world. Before I go on with my story, let me congratulate the organizers of this festival for bringing literature back to its roots in the festival after a long period of its exile and estrangement during the modernist period. To continue with my story, the situation that I faced during the inception of my writing constituted a violent clash between the series of opposites, my own culture of orality and performance on the one hand, and the impersonal page of the printed book, my inherited culture of collective communication and the culture of individual expression, and the experimentation forced on me the society of kinship and sharing as opposed to the society of selfish rat race towards individual success. My works are all my works are all organically interrelated with each other and with my tradition. They all tell the story in different forms and accents of Shivapura, the mythical version of actual Godgeri, my village, how its century-old agrarian and artisan culture was undermined by what Yeats has called the ugly tide of modern life. In fact, the sacred bond of interdependence of human beings and nature was replaced by an order constructed mechanically through for possessions. Human beings, okay. In effect, the secret bond of interdependence of human beings and nature was replaced by an order constructed mechanically through greed for possessions, turning all human values into market and money value. The throes and tragedies that my organic community was subjected to is the burden of my song. My works are, in one sense, passionate elegies to a vanishing world. This elegiac note figures prominently in my early works. This may not be a very happy take on the myth of progress which has dragged the world into amnesia about everything invaluable before the coming of engine and computer. The high priests of progress compliment themselves and their age by pointing out hierarchy nature of the pre-modern world. But they throw the baby with the bath, for they forget the celebratory aspect of bygone cultures, where it was possible to experience mystery and infinite in our finite existence. My early works thus castigate the blind celebration of life of mind that does not feel and think with heart, sense, and most important of all, imagination that adds color and beauty to our incomplete world through myth, magic, and ritual. The modern world and its literature spoke about the present and past in its demythified, anemic, and unpoetic language. I spoke of the modern world through the inherited medium of multi-layered language in which the world is more living than lifeless objects. While most of my most of my award-winning contemporary writers spoke an idiom of reason and irony, I sang in the language of passion and anguish. They made friends with history. I could not escape the fascination of myth. Love and lyricism had escaped from their world, but these very things were the very breath of my words. Having plumbed passionately into the depth of tragedy in my early works, I have set myself on another course of healing and recovery in my recent works after my epic poem Chakori and my play Mahamai. This mood is even more pronounced in my recent works like Shikhar Surya. The bygone world are not entirely bygone. They have also bequeathed to us, to their great cumulative wisdom generated through ages, the tools and means of recovery. My protagonists, undeterred by the rotten state of things, are now engaged in healing and saving the world from the words. I contracted the habit of composing songs and weaving stories when I was trying to escape the excruciating poverty of my family into the midst of places where our villagers were acting out their night-long folk plays and bailatas. Their singing voices, dancing feet, dumb beats transported to me to the world of myths, metaphors, and symbols more real than the real world. It is there that my songs were born. That groundswell is still not dry. At this ripe age, my writing is still continuing unabated. Though I agree that the basic function of art and poetry is to communicate to serve hridayas, I feel it important for art to present a particular regional culture self-apprehension. I did not walk the way of many fellow writers who sold their soul to the imported, newfangled ideas and ideologies of the alien Western cultures. All my farm-side idioms came from my native culture. Neither have I followed the masters who derived their imaginations from Ramayana and Mahabharata. I forged for myself an idiom stemming from the collective mythology of my region, inhabited by saints and charanas as well as local legendary heroes who are part of the vibrant and living reality. Though I inherited modernity, I was never at home there. Though modernism was forced upon my generation, I stayed clear from it. Being born not into a family of learned scholars, but into that of a humble blacksmith, I had to develop my own skills as a wordsmith in my own individual odyssey with with the invaluable help of my gurus and my people. Traditional cultures like the one I inherited saw poetry and performance as the fiesta, but the alienated modern culture gave to writing the performance and character of mourning. Negotiating between these two pulls, I have now evolved an idiom different from both, which is individual in its intensity but collective in intent. This is a dynamic balance very difficult to attain and more difficult to retain. Most of my contemporaries and younger generation writers flounded between the two poles. I am relieved by the fact that at least a few young writers in my language have achieved this feat in a different way. I would like to make a special mention here of H.S. Prakash, a poet and playwright of great potential who has worked out my kind of equilibrium in the opposite way. Coming from a metro background, he found his inherited urban language improvised and had to soak himself in the living folk, tribal and lore, absorb the best of that into his own creative expression. Like me, he too has turned his back to the much bandied about Ramayana and Mahabharata cultures to find inspiration in folk and devotional cultures to turn his works into a mourning fiesta. Once again, I thank the organizers of this festival for having given me an opportunity to share my feelings with all these people.
Thank you. I'll ask some questions to Setu, and then I'll come back to you for the poems. In fact, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is very similar. Tell us something about your growth as a writer, the role that your village and your people in the village must have played in your writing. And also of the kind of writers who must have had an influence on you. I also know that you were in Delhi for quite some time, and I came to Delhi much later, and I know that there was a group of writers, they used to meet every month. It's called something called Sahiti Sakhyam, which means a kind of fraternity of writers, in which quite a lot of major writers from Kerala were involved. O.V. Vijayan, whom some of you must have definitely heard of, M. Mukundan. Some of the finest writers, particularly fiction writers, were associated with that. And I understand you were also, to a great extent, involved in that. So, and what did that do to you? So, altogether, something about your growth as a writer.
Well, thank you, Sachi. Good morning, everybody. At the outset, I would tell something about my own village. When I look back, it almost looks like a surrealistic dream, I would say. I grew up in a small village of Kerala, which had great historical importance. I would say there is a particular hillock in the village. Atop the hillock, there is a Krishna temple. Down below, there is a mosque, a Jewish synagogue, and a Christian church, all within half a kilometer radius. All these were put up in the land given by the then Raja about 5 or 6 centuries back. Perhaps the only one of its kind anywhere in the world. Now we conduct seminars for communal harmony and all that. This was being practiced at that point of time by the so-called benevolent Rajas. But at the same time, the village had great constraints. We didn't have electricity in my part of the village. So until I completed my college education, we were at the mercy of kerosene lamps. So I had a very tough time at that point out. When I look back, that's why I said it looked almost like a surrealistic dream, because we were always in the dark. The only lamppost we had in the village was the village library. Well-stacked library. We had all the classics translated into Malayalam. That way we are all lucky, because Malayalam takes quite a lot from the world classics and other Indian languages. So by the time I completed my college education, I had read all the masters like Tolstoy or Hemingway or Dostoevsky, or Indian masters like Premchand or Tarashankar, Bankim Chandra. To that extent, because this was perhaps my only window to the outside world. So after, I would say, 3 or 4 decades when I visited Calcutta, I think all the streets looked familiar to me, because I have traveled extensively through the Bengali novels, because the terrain was so familiar to me. Because at that point of time, possibly even in my earlier days, into the metropolis, it was literally, and I learned to swim the hard way. There was no other escape. And thereafter, I changed many jobs. I worked in different parts of the country, including Punjab, Madhya Pradesh, and Delhi, Chennai. So again, this again gave me a much wider pan-Indian vision, I would say. Perhaps that helped me in my writing. Perhaps in my novels, we have characters. There are Bengali characters in my novels. Sometimes, it's again a city environment. Sometimes it's a village environment. This holistic view of the country as such helped me quite a lot in my writing. Yesterday in one of my sessions, I said I am absolutely against this term regional language or the Bhasha Sahitya and all. It's Indian language. It's Indian literature. Because a person writing in Malayalam, like me or Mr. Sachidanandan, or a person who writes in a dialect in Northeast, they're all writing in Indian language. They are speaking Indian language. Perhaps this is one area perhaps we have to apply our mind. So my subsequent assignments or my travels all over the country helped me a lot in writing, as he has correctly put it, when I landed up in Delhi, I was scribbling a lot, but I didn't have the courage to get them published or even to show to somebody, not even to my roommate. But it so happened in Delhi that Kerala Club at that point of time had a kind of arrangement where every Friday we used to meet a few of the aspiring writers and the well-known writers. Either they could be fiction writers, or they could be poets, or they could be critics, and there will be presentation. Somebody will read a poem, the others will tear it apart. There are a lot of dialogues, there will be a lot of criticism. So we used to call it Good Friday. So possibly, normally you leave the place quite confused or perhaps quite uncomfortable with whatever you have written.
Today is the day of crucifixion.
Yeah, day of crucifixion. Although it's called Good Friday. The thing is that, see, for a new entrant that way, it gave me some kind of courage. O.V. Vijayan was a well-established cartoonist, well-established columnist, writer. So I thought, if Vijayan could write, why not me? After all, he also looks like me, although he was 10 years elder to me. And there was another well-known writer called Kakanadan. We were working in the same office. So that gave me some kind of courage, which was within me, but I couldn't locate it earlier. Then, without telling anybody, I scribbled out a story and sent it to the topmost magazine in Malayalam, Madhubhumi Weekly. So that was a great, I would say, I don't know how I did it. Normally, in such things, will end up in editor's waste paper basket. So I didn't attach any envelope or whatever it is. But to my surprise, it was published within a month. And again, that story was not based on the Kerala atmosphere. It was based on the drought in Bihar at that time. In the mid-60s, Bihar had a severe drought. So when I traveled in some of the villages and all that, the kind of things I saw there, I lost my sleep for 2-3 days. I thought, perhaps this is one subject possibly I could write on. I never knew it is, I didn't know at that time whether this is a story or how to write a story, because I've never been a student of literature. My subject was science. I had never had a guru or a mentor. To that extent, it was a plunge. So I realized later on, if you play the game without knowing the rules, perhaps you are at a great advantage, because you set your own rules, because there may be some whistleblowers here and there. Perhaps after some time you will get used to it. So that's how I started writing. And I was a bit lucky that way, because my first story was published in the topmost magazine of Malayalam. And thereafter, there was no looking back. For the last 4.5 decades, I have been writing almost about 35 titles, novels, and short stories. I think perhaps it has been a fairly exciting experience for me. Thank you.
One of the things that I and other critics have noticed about your writing is mostly you have heroines more than heroes, in the sense there's a profound understanding and a consistent attempt to grasp the secrets of the woman's psyche. I mean, how did you come to that? I mean, this is not something that I find in every writer, but in your case, I can go on citing the titles of many of your stories and novels. The woman has been at the center of things and the center of the world. How come that you developed that kind of a vision, which is very different from that of quite a few of the male writers in Malayalam or elsewhere?
Quite true. This has been pointed out off and on, because basically, this is one of the areas where I found quite interesting, or perhaps this need to be looked into as a creative writer. Because basically, the mindscape of the forlorn woman, or the marginalized women, or particularly in the case of man-woman relationship, we had a few cases, or rather it's quite common now, when there is a breakup in the marriage and the woman is thrown into wilderness. Perhaps this is an area where a writer needs to look into her mindscape, delve deep into her mind. What is the thought process? What are the kind of experiences, the process which is going through her mind? So I was not interested in the peripherals. No, I was not looking at the upper level. There is a sub-level below that. Perhaps as a writer, as a fiction writer, I thought, why not follow their, I would say, solitary journey through their mindscape. So this has been one of the areas where I have been trying to concentrate during the first, I would say, early stages of my writing. And here, I won't call them heroines, because basically many of them are village housewives. Obviously, either a school teacher or an ordinary middle class housewife. And they try to grapple with this problem in their own rustic way. They try to find out solution, or they ask questions. They fling questions at the society, and when the questions rebound, they try to locate an answer within herself. So this is a process, a somewhat bizarre process. So this is what I was trying to look at.
Yeah. He has quite a few novels. The most famous, perhaps, is Pandavapuram, which has been read widely, translated into English and quite a few other Indian languages. And also I understand there's a film based on that, which unfortunately I haven't seen, Niragar Chaya in Bengali. So would you say something about that novel, and also read maybe an excerpt from that?
Yeah. Actually, the Pandavapuram was written 36 years back. It was serialized in Madhrubhumi. It came out in different languages, and a movie was made in Bengali, in Malayalam also. And you see, the thing is that it's again almost the same kind of subject. As I told you, in the village setup, milieu, when a marriage breaks up, the kind of stigma attached to the woman, obviously she's at fault. Nobody questions the man. So here, one particular school teacher, she is in such a spot, very innocent woman. So ultimately, she frames questions. She was trying to find out what went wrong. Am I wrong? Or are the surroundings responsible for it? Are my relatives responsible for it? She kind of frames a series of questions. And obviously, some of the questions are directed towards the so-called missing husband. They rebound. Some of the questions are directed towards society, relatives, people around them, the neighbors. They also rebound. Nobody has any answer. Then she realizes, okay, I have to find out the answer myself. Then in that process, she fantasizes and creates an imaginary world called Pandavapuram. And there she tries to seek solace. She tries to get answers for all the unanswered questions. So this is the process. So as a novelist, I have tried to follow the solitary journey through Devi, the main character, through her own mindscape. So here, perhaps this, as I told you, this was written almost 4 decades back. Had Devi been reborn, she would have been an activist now, possibly. Her way of reacting would have been much, much different.
Would you read a little excerpt?
Frankly, I'm not quite good at book reading. Interestingly, a couple of, I think Mr. H.M. Naqvi, who won the Asian Bookworm, I was the DSC prize a couple of years back here. He happened to read it in Sharjah Book Fair in wonderful resonant voice. I envied him. I said, hats off to you. I cannot read it like that. Anyway, I'll make an attempt.
Novel's voice has its own uniqueness.
Yeah,
whatever.
should be. Anyway, as I told you, the title is Pandavapuram. Last night, as I lay waiting for the usual nightmare, Pandavapuram came to my mind, scattering the many-colored glass pieces of extraordinary memories. The rainbow-colored chandelier which hung in the church of the refugee camp must have fallen down and shattered. I first saw the small houses with their red tiled floors and yellow tin roofs, and behind them were the yellow-colored buildings of the same type. The whole colony looked yellow. The people's faces had turned reddish yellow from breathing the poisonous air which the long chimneys of the factories belched. The black path that connected the factory and the colony had lampposts which spat yellow light into the night. Dirty yellow smoke always hung over the colony like a cloud. Its shape and form changed constantly. Sometimes it became the demon set free by the fishermen hovering with the mouth agape. Sometimes it became Durga the destroyer, and sometimes the form that was of the quiet mother sunk in meditation. And according to these changes, the moods of the hapless slaves in the colony also changed. The sun had set. A mist had spread on the Maidan behind the colony. I walked alone across the mist-dampened grass, all alone, all alone. The dark and the fog mingled together to hang a number of thin curtains before me. There was no one in the Maidan. I asked myself, Devi, aren't you afraid to walk alone in this deserted Maidan at night? I had no reply to that. I cut across the Maidan and continued to walk aimlessly through the wet path between the fenced-in orange trees. After walking a short distance, I looked back with a start. Was the watchman with the fierce-looking mustache there leaning against the gate behind me? My mind sobbed in despair as I tried to build up Pandavapuram with each stone I could find, a piece of glass, a piece of handful of air. A piece of glass, a handful of air, the smells and sounds that could be perceived. I will read it again. As I tried to build up Pandavapuram, with each stone I could find, a piece of glass, a handful of air, the smells and sounds that could be perceived. Years back, bewildered, I had stepped into Pandavapuram as the wife of a man I had met just a week before. Last night, as I tossed sleepless in bed, I heard the hoofbeats of the ancient horse of the dark old driver of Pandavapuram. The horse had jumped over the low bamboo barrier and was going round and round the house, hoofs beats thundering. I was afraid to open the window and look out. I was sure that that old driver, would be sitting on the horse. I had forgotten his name, but the rheumy eyes under the dark faded cap and his face covered with pockmarks still cling to my memory. I cannot forget him. Kunjikutetan and I had gone to Devi temple on top of the hill in his horse cart. I think that's okay? Or some more? Little more. Yeah. The goddess sat cross-legged in the sanctum within the granite walls on the hilltop. She wore red silk and red sindoor marked her parting. Her face flamed in the fire of meditation. The sindoor reddened her face. The paramours of Pandavapuram fell into that fire one by one and burned like moths. She took these ashes and marked the foreheads of those unfortunate women who had lost their husbands. She was the protector of the Sumangalis of Pandavapuram. Every girl who married and came to Pandavapuram prayed, Devi, O goddess, protect us from the paramours of Pandavapuram. Give us the strength to evade their spells. Still the paramours strutted arrogantly through the streets of Pandavapuram to destroy the defenseless girls. But now, as I sit waiting 1,000 miles away on this deserted platform for the train which will bring the unknown guest, Pandavapuram seems very far away. With a start, with pain, I think again, Pandavapuram is so far away.
You have written short stories as well as novels.
Yeah.
I had been listening yesterday and day before to several discussions on the future of the novel and on the form of the short story. How would you describe in your mind? Do you know in advance that it's going to be a short story or a novel, or it has the potential of a novel?
Not precisely. I would say, although I have written a fairly good number of stories and quite comfortable with that. Unfortunately, I'm known as a novelist. I would like to be called a story writer, to be exact, because I really enjoyed writing stories, because stories are, I would say, closer to poetry, because there is a very clear, concise format, there is a shape as beautiful as a woman. But whereas in the case of novels, perhaps if you look at a larger canvas, perhaps in case you want to portray a much bigger world where the time and space comes in, perhaps you will have to look at a different form, and novel is perhaps the only form which will give you that kind of liberty. And story is so concise, so concentrated, and sometimes it could be quite emotional also. It creates some kind of emotional response. So to that extent, writing a story is much more difficult, because it's a very tough task. Even a single word can spoil, extra unwanted word can spoil that story, or perhaps, the kind of time you spent or the kind of meditation required to shape a story is like writing a poem. To that extent, you enjoy a little more freedom when you write a novel, because you have a larger canvas. There could be a series of incidents. You'll be developing sequences, and there will be any number of characters which would convey whatever you want to say. There will be conflicts, emotional conflicts, or conflicts with the society at large, and all kinds of situations. So to that, the concept of human predicament comes in a little more concentrated form in the shape of a story. Whereas in the case of novel, the contours are much more wide, and both are equally important because when you handle a certain subject, because the latest novel, I'll come to that later.
You can say something about
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
Maru.
You know, actually, it has a history behind it. You see, about 2,000 years back, a lot of things were happening on the western coast because a lot of Indo-Roman trade was taking place related to spices. So there was a port on the western fort, which is near my village, which was frequented by the Romans and Greeks at that point of time. They used to come here for buying spices 2,000 years back. So recent excavations in that area have revealed some of the very interesting aspects of what is happening at that point of time. So that really triggered my interest in the topic. When I rather went into that history, I spent nearly 4 or 5 years on that because that particular port was called Musiris, and it was as important as Alexandria on the Mediterranean at that point of time. So, you know, as at that point of time there was no Suez Canal, so if somebody has to sail from Alexandria, from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Ocean and reach our western coast, you'll have to circle African continent as such. There was no shortcut. So these people found out a very interesting method. It was known as Hippalus wind. In the 1st century AD, they found out that if you could set sail from the Red Sea on a normal, bigger country craft and catch the monsoon wind, southwest monsoon wind, on the 40th day, you can reach the western Kerala coast. The wind takes you, the monsoon wind brings you to the Kerala coast. Then they do their trade transactions, and when the northeast monsoon happens, they go back. They take the return wind and go back and there is a port called Bernike in the Red Sea. And from there on camel top or whatever, they carry the goods to Alexandria, about 500 miles or so. So this was happening. So at that period of time, a good number of Romans and Greeks used to come to our area, stay there during the monsoon period. So I felt as a writer, these are all recorded facts, it's all available in history. I felt, you know, when these people come and stay there for 2-3 months, a lot of exchanges would have taken place. Even human, emotional, cultural, or even, I would say, the language. They would have developed some kind of survival glossary to survive in this kind of business. They have to do some trade also. They have to collect pepper from the faraway forests and villages and all that. It's a massive transaction. At that time, about not less than 80 to 90 ships used to anchor in that area. So, like that, so I worked on that particular novel called Marupiravi, that is rebirth, how this Musiris is reborn in the shape of a new container terminal which has come up in Kerala. So this is how I developed that story. And so here, a lot of preparation was required, and I had to really work on it in a big way. Sorry, I took a lot of time, sorry.
Thank you. We need some time for questions and answers. Before that, I would like Kambarji to sing your Mao song. Would you do that for our audience? He has a wonderful elegy, of course, a little humorous kind of elegy for Mao Zedong when he died. And I've heard him sing it beautifully. So we will be very happy if you do that. He's a wonderful singer.
I wrote this Mao Zedong song the day he died. And you know, in our beginning, we were all influenced by Mao Zedong and with his ideologies and to construct a new world, etc., etc. We poets have dreams, lot of dreams, but we don't have power to realize it. Politicians have power, but they don't have dreams. But you know, and Mao Zedong had both. He was a poet, and also he was the chairman of the whole nation. And I was so sorry. He also couldn't do anything. So that's the poem which I said. First, I will read the translation. Shall I?
Okay, yeah.
Read the translation. How can I forget? Huh?
Maybe I'll read the translation.
Huh?
I'll read the translation and you
Yeah, yeah.
No, it's a short one. Or
You don't
he'll
want,
sing. It's a very
you
short.
don't want my poem?
It's a very short one. You know. I'll just read the.
Acha.
But translation doesn't convey much because it's a kind of song. How can I forget you even if I want to, Mao Zedong? You saw through the trick of 5 elements a new world shone before your eyes, desiring to give the cipher a shape and build a wall around the space, and to remake the living and lifeless things, desiring to bring down a brand new sun. You wanted to dam the stream of tears and bridge the bank of rivers of blood. Rooting yourself in fathomless waters, you became a torch with a blazing head. You made a chariot of the broken souls drawn by the horses of 10 avatars. You, the god of 10 horses, said, "Look, I have come, the self-same sun." Set everything aflame. You stood on the fence and exiled the great ones into caves and tombs. You beckoned Kailas, sowed yellow, grew yellow, and reaped yellow. Even the flowers were yellow on the barbed fence. You renamed every color yellow, but were blind to your own jaundiced eye. The sole king of ragged-browed beggars, the sole king of famished pot-bellies, in spite of daily reports of birth and death, you took a new birth every day. You taught a death to half the world, and yet failed to learn how to die. A cupola appeared on the wall. Your life became a legend, a myth, an illusion that disappeared in the empty space. The flame died out, and yet the light remained. How can I forget you, even if I want to, Mao Zedong? And
The poem is Marte Nandar Mareli Hanga Mautse Tunga Marte Nandar Mareli Hanga ಪಂಚಭೂತದಾಗ ವಂಚನೆ ಕಂಡಿ ಕಣ್ಣಿನಂಚಿನಾಗ ಹೊಸ ಜಗ ಕಂಡಿ ಸೊನ್ನಿಗೆ ಆಕಾರ ಬರದೆ ನಂದಿ ಬಯಲಿಗೆ ಗೂಡೆ ಕಟ್ಟೆ ನಂದಿ ಸಚರಾಚರಗಳ ರಚನೆ ಮಾಡುವುದಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇರೊಬ್ಬ ಸೂರ್ಯನ ತರ್ತೆ ನಂದಿ ಮರ್ತೆ ನಂದರ್ ಆಹಾ ಮರ್ತೆ ನಂದರ್ ಮರೇಲಿ ಹಂಗ ಮಾಮೂತ್ಸೆ ತುಂಗ ಮರ್ತೆ ನಂದರ್ ಮರೇಲಿ ಹಂಗ ಕಣ್ಣೀರಿನ ಹೊಳಿಗಡ್ಡ ಕಟ್ಟಿದಿ ಹರಿವನ್ನ ಎತ್ತರಕ್ಕೆ ಒಡ್ಡ ಕಟ್ಟಿದಿ ಮಡುವಿನ ನಡುವ ಕಾಲ ನೂರಿಕೊಂಡು ಬತ್ತಿಯಾಗಿ ತಲೆ ಹೊತ್ತಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿ ಮನುಷ್ಯರ ಮುರದಿ ತೇರ ಕಟ್ಟಿದಿ ಹತ್ತವ ತಾಲಿ ಹಂಗ ಮಾಮೂತ್ಸೆ ತುಂಗ ಮರ್ತೆ ನಂದರ ಮರೇಲಿ ಹಂಗ ಬೆಂಕಿ ಹಚ್ಚಿದಿ ಬೇಡ್ಯಾಗ ನಿಂತಿ ಸಿದ್ಧರ ಗುದ್ದ ಹೊಗಿಸಿದಿ ಹಂಗ ಬಿಟ್ಟ ಹಂಗಾಮದ ಬೆದಿಗಿ ಕೈಯ ಬೀಸಿ ಕೈಲಾಸವ ಕರೆದಿ ಹಳದಿ ಬಿತ್ತಿದಿ ಹಳದಿಯ ಬೆಳದಿ ಮುಳ್ಳಬೇದೆಗೂ ಹೂವಿನ ಹಳದಿ ಬಣ್ಣದ ಹೆಸರ ಬದಲ ಮಾಡಿದಿ ಮರ್ತೇನಂದರ್ ಆಹಾ ಮರ್ತೇನಂದರ್ ಮರೇಲಿ ಹಂಗ ಮಾವೋತ್ಸೆ ತುಂಗ ಮರ್ತೇನಂದರ್ ಮರೇಲಿ ಹಂಗ.
Thank you. Can you take one or two questions? No? No? Maybe a question or two. I think we should. No?
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. I'm so sorry we don't have any time for Q&A. You can catch the authors at the book signing venue, which is on the left of this hall. So thank you, everyone. Please make sure you're taking belongings with you. If you've carried food plates or glasses, please make sure you drop the empty bits into the dustbin, all paper, etc.